In this design unit, we'll take a closer look at texture. Texture usually references the surface characteristics of a piece, things that you could identify by touch as soft, smooth, fuzzy, bumpy, prickly, and often things that you could identify even without touching them as seeming soft, smooth, bumpy, fuzzy, or prickly. In this lesson, we've explored layering to add dimension and a texture technique I call astrakhan looping. These textures are based on relatively simple variations in the way we combine and execute the basic looping stitch. That simple looping stitch is the foundation element for so many things you can do with looping. Elements are parts of a whole that can't be separated further into essential ingredients. They're the basics that we build on. In Lesson 2, you learned that texture is considered a design element. We also discussed design principles, ways we organize and combine those elements. Since texture is considered a design element, we should be able to organize and combine texture with design principles in mind. In other words, we can apply texture to concepts like the design principles pattern, contrast, variety, proportion, scale, repetition, and balance. So let's do that consciously to help integrate that notion into your unconscious in the future when you're making design choices in freeform looping. For example, for this piece, I made a conscious choice to reference the textures found on ancient walls. For the substrate, I coiled whole rod willow using waxed linen. Then I washed the coiled surface with an artist medium called gesso to give it the feeling of ancient wattle and daub. This piece was inspired by the walls of Tara, the legendary seat of the Irish god kings. The textural looping that embellishes the surface represents the lichen that covers the standing stones that remain on that sacred hill, although any walls have dissolved into the mists of time. I'd like you to try a similar conscious design exercise. I've included a few photographs here and in your class handouts, which you can use as inspiration, or find a photograph or something else to inspire you. Personally, I'm partial to textures found in nature, but you might see more potential in something urban or industrial. In any case, consider where and how that texture is found and any potential symbolic meaning it has. Then start thinking of ways you might interpret it in freeform looping. What materials might you use? What colors? What are your reasons for considering one type of thread versus another? How might you organize elements to take advantage of the principles of design? Make a few rough sketches and some notes about your intentions. Then work a small sample, not a miniature representation of a bigger project, but a small freeform motif or other element to which you can apply some texture to get a feel for how your concept would translate from your imagination into fiber. Now, I have to be honest. For the two demonstration projects in this lesson, I did not begin with photograph or other inspiration as my starting point. But I have been exploring layered textures and what I call astrakhan texture in looping for quite some time. They've become part of my vocabulary. I'm comfortable incorporating them into design on that barely conscious level where freeform is so much fun. So once I have a general plan and materials in place, I can relax and stitch and see what happens for a while before I have to rein in my enthusiasm. You see, I love texture and I love stitching texture. Without some self-imposed restraint, I would work any texture way past the point where it has the desired impact. So I have to challenge myself to include some quieter areas that are less demanding of attention to balance that texture. Balance doesn't necessarily mean equality, though. Equal proportions can actually seem static, even a bit dull. So my goal is generally to include enough of the fun texture for it to seem important without drawing all the attention in a piece, unless, of course, that's the desired impact. Even then, you'll want to consider the function of the piece as you incorporate texture. On this bag, for example, I decided to limit the astrakhan texture to an edge that would not be against my body. And except for the stitching I did in the demonstration unit, I waited to work most of the astrakhan edging until after I had worked the freeform that covers the front of the bag, which was worked with motifs and fellings. When I've worked an area with a lot of texture or dimensional stitching before the other parts of a project, it seems the yarn is always getting hung up in the texture. Your challenges will be different. You'll learn how they're different by giving design conscious consideration in the planning phase of your freeform projects and as you evaluate finished projects to learn from them. Do the lines lead your eye to other areas of interest or make you wonder what's on the other side? Are shapes varied in size? Are there interesting intervals between lines and shapes? Do lines or shapes repeat in a way that adds a sense of rhythm or movement? Do changes in stitch density add interest to the texture? Above all, keep stitching. Challenge yourself to interpret different things. They don't have to be literal. Just use them as a starting point for some texture or motif or filling. Build your vocabulary and become fluent in freeform. Then see where it leads you. I can't wait to see what you come up with and hope you'll share your explorations in the class forum. In the meantime, have fun stitching.